On the first day of October 1949, Mao Zedong stepped up to the parapet of the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing, looked out over a square that had been emptied and refilled for the cameras, and told the world that a new China was born. The People's Republic was proclaimed. 1 million people in gray and blue stood beneath him, chanting. 21 guns fired in salute. The message to every Chinese listener was simple. The age of humiliation was over. The message that nobody quite said out loud was harder. The man who had lost the country was still alive. He was on an island across the Taiwan Strait, and he had not yet admitted that he had lost it. 4 years earlier, none of this looked possible. In the autumn of 1945, Chiang Kai-shek possessed everything that a man in his position is supposed to need. He held the recognized government of China, seated in Nanjing. He commanded an army numbered in the millions. He had an air force, a navy, ports on the coast, the seats in the United Nations, the signatures on the surrender documents from Tokyo. Above all, he had the United States, the wealthiest and most powerful country on earth, writing the checks. The commander of the communists, Mao Zedong, was still in his cave headquarters at Yan'an in the dry hills of the northwest, with a force that, on paper, was a fraction of the nationalist size, equipped with weapons grabbed from the Japanese or taken from collapsed Kuomintang units. So the question this film is built around is not a sentimental one, it is an arithmetic one. In roughly 48 months, a government that claimed to rule something close to 500 million people lost its civil war to an enemy that, by every conventional measure, it should have buried. The explanation that has traveled farthest in the West is also the laziest, that Mao won because the communists were better soldiers, braver, more disciplined, more in touch with the people. There is truth in that, but it is not the whole truth, and it is not the most important truth. Because Mao did not need to be better than Chiang, he only needed to be less broken than Chiang. And the nationalist state, when the war was over, was already broken in ways that foreign money could not see from a distance and could not reach from Washington. To understand how that happened, you have to start not in 1945, but in a small town in the east coast province of Zhejiang in the 1880s. Chiang Kai-shek was born on the 31st of October 1887 in Fenghua into a salt merchant household that had seen better days. There is nothing in his childhood that points at the future ruler of the most populous country on earth. He was a difficult boy, raised by his mother after his father died young, schooled in the Chinese classics, restless in the way that Chinese teenagers from provincial merchant families have often been restless, aware that there was a wider world and that the old one was closing. He found his way first to a military academy in northern China, and then, like a surprising number of his generation of Chinese officers, to Japan for further training. He served in the Japanese army from 1909 to 1911. The years in uniform are not a small detail. The Imperial Japanese Army of that period was probably the most professional fighting force in Asia, and Chiang came out of it with an enduring admiration for discipline, hierarchy, and drill. Those are the things he would later try to build. They are also the things that, taken too far, would help break him. In 1911, he was back in China during the uprisings that toppled the Manchu dynasty and produced the Chinese Republic. He fought. He was a marginal figure, but he was in the room, and the room mattered. By 1918, he had joined the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, then a small and fractious revolutionary outfit under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen. Sun was the father of the Republican idea in modern China, and the man whose three principles, nationalism, democracy, livelihood, would later be inscribed, in Chiang's own hand, over the gate of every school in the country. The decisive moment came in 1924, when Sun, increasingly dependent on Soviet advisors and Soviet money, set up the Whampoa Military Academy outside the southern port city of Guangzhou. He appointed Chiang Kai-shek to run it. This is where Chiang minted his officer corps. The cadets who passed through Whampoa in the late 1920s became the backbone of his army for the next 20 years. They owed their careers to him personally. They were loyal to him personally. And that, more than any doctrine or any constitution, is what held the Kuomintang together, a chain of personal patronage that ran from the top down. Sun Yat-sen died of cancer in 1925. Chiang moved quickly. Within a year, he had launched the Northern Expedition, a military campaign aimed at crushing the regional warlords who had carved northern and western China into personal fiefdoms since the fall of the dynasty, and at bringing the whole country under one government. By 1928, he declared China unified. The capital was fixed at Nanjing, on the Yangtze River. There was a ceremony at Sun Yat-sen's mausoleum, and for a brief moment, it was possible to believe that the long fragmentation was over. It is worth pausing on what that achievement actually was. China in the 1920s was not a state in the way that Britain or France was a state. It was a collection of provinces, some of them governed by men who had their own armies, their own currencies, their own railways, their own tax systems. Bringing them under a single flag, even a flag whose authority they only half acknowledged, was a real thing. No one had done it since the Manchus, and even they had never done it completely. Chiang did. Or at least, he appeared to. Because in the same year that he was finishing the Northern Expedition, in 1927, he did something that would, 22 years later, help destroy him. He turned on the communists inside the Kuomintang. The First United Front, as it was called, had been a marriage of convenience between Sun's nationalists and the new Chinese Communist Party, organized in 1921 with the help of Soviet advisors. Both sides thought they could use the other. The communists brought agitators with experience of the labor movement in the coastal cities. The nationalists brought the army and the international recognition. The arrangement worked while Sun was alive because Sun wanted it to work, and because Moscow told both sides to behave. When Sun died, the deal began to crack. The left wing of the Kuomintang, led by Wang Jingwei, wanted to deepen the alliance and lean on the workers' movement in Shanghai and Guangzhou. Chiang wanted to clear the cities of communist organizers before he turned north to fight the warlords. In April 1927, in Shanghai, with the help of the city's Green Gang bosses, Chiang turned the gangs and the army against the communist-led unions. Thousands of CCP members and labor organizers were killed. Some estimate the number in the low thousands, others in the tens of thousands. Either way, the political effect was decisive. The First United Front was over. The communists, who had been a legal party working openly in the cities, were driven underground, and a few of them walked into the countryside with what guns they could carry. Two things are true at the same time here, and the film will hold both of them. First, Chiang did something extraordinary. He unified, on paper, a country that had been falling apart for a generation, and he gave it a capital, a flag, a foreign ministry, and a seat in the councils of the world. Second, with the same hands, he created the enemy that would, in 22 years, take it all away from him. With one hand he built a state, with the other he gave that state the wound it would not heal from. The next 20 years, between 1927 and 1937, are usually called the Nanjing Decade, and they are usually described as a period of relative stability and modernizing reform. Some of that is fair. The currency was reformed, the railways were extended, a start was made on industrial planning, universities were founded. There were also enormous gaps. The reach of the central government in Nanjing was thinner than its rhetoric. Many of the regional warlords had been beaten but not destroyed. They submitted to Chiang on paper and continued to behave as semi-independent rulers in fact. Tax collection outside the lower Yangtze was patchy at best. The army was paid irregularly. The officer corps was loyal, but loyal in the way of a family firm, with promotion going to men who knew the right people rather than to men who could plan a campaign. This is the structure that would, eventually, lose the Civil War. It is worth saying that plainly now, in 1928, because the film will return to it again and again, in 1945, and in 1947, and in the autumn of 1949. The question was never simply whether Chiang could beat Mao. It was whether the kind of state he had built was the kind of state that could survive a long war against an enemy that was willing to do the things that Chiang's state would not. Now look at the 8 years that hollowed the structure out. The war with Japan from 1937 to 1945 will be told not as a story of heroism and atrocity, although it contained both, but as a story of what it did to the machinery of government. The best divisions Chiang had trained, the modern units equipped with German and Italian advice, were spent in the battles around Shanghai and Nanjing in the first months. In December 1936, in the city of Xi'an, Chiang Kai-shek was kidnapped by two of his own generals and held for 2 weeks until he agreed to something he had been refusing for years. He agreed to a formal alliance with the communists against Japan. The kidnapping is famous. The alliance that came out of it is the Second United Front, and it is the thing that the next decade turns on. Because from that moment until the Japanese surrender in 1945, the nationalists and the communists were, on paper, fighting the same war. On the ground, each side was preparing for the war after it. The Japanese opened the full-scale invasion in July 1937 with the incident at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing. Within weeks, they had taken Beijing and Tiananmen. By the autumn, they were at Shanghai. Chiang made the decision to fight for Shanghai, and it is a decision that needs to be set down carefully because it cost him almost everything he had. The reasoning from inside the nationalist command was straightforward. China had to show the world, and in particular the Western powers, that it intended to resist. If Shanghai fell without a battle, the international sympathy that Chiang needed to draw Western support would never arrive. He therefore committed the best-trained and best-equipped divisions he had, the units built up over the Nanjing decade with German and Italian advisors, modern artillery, the first Chinese tanks, an air force that had been carefully assembled. For 3 months, the Chinese fought house by house in Shanghai. The foreign press sent back extraordinary pictures. The defense was also a defeat. By November 1937, the city was lost. By December, the Japanese were at Nanjing. And what happened there, the rape of the capital, the mass killing of civilians and disarmed soldiers, is one of the 20th century's worst crimes and does not need to be repeated here. What matters for the film is what followed the fall of Nanjing. The nationalist government retreated up the Yangtze, first to Wuhan, then, after Wuhan fell in the autumn of 1938, deep into the interior of the country, to Chongqing, a river port set among hills and fog in Sichuan province. The capital would remain there until the end of the war. The relocation is the hinge of the whole story. In a single year, Chiang had lost the eastern seaboard, the modern cities, the ports, the banks, the customs houses, the salt administration, the factories, the universities, and most of the railway system. He had lost, in effect, the tax base of the country. What he kept was the hinterland, which had always been poorer and harder to govern. The budget of the central government, which had been drawn in large part from customs revenue collected at Shanghai, collapsed. From that moment on, the government was living on borrowed money, on American and British loans, on whatever could be scraped out of the provinces, and on printing. It is important not to skip over this, because the consequences do not show up for 10 years. A state that cannot collect its own taxes is a state that cannot pay its own soldiers in real money. In 1938, the problem was disguised. The war was on, there was a shared enemy, foreign credit was available, the army was still being mobilized. By the time the war ended, in 1945, the disguise had worn through. The government in Chongqing had survived, the state behind it had not. The Japanese occupation of the coast also reorganized the country physically. The 8th Route Army, the main communist military force, which in 1937 had been a few tens of thousands of men under nominal nationalist command, was pushed into the less hills of Shanxi and then out into the countryside of the North China Plain. There, it did something that is worth describing in plain words. It stayed. It lived among the villages. It taxed lightly, or not at all. It recruited from the poor. It redistributed land where it could. It behaved, in many places, less like an army of occupation and more like a returning local government. By the end of the war, the communist base areas covered large parts of North China and parts of Central China. The Japanese held the railways and the cities. The communists held the villages. The nationalists, meanwhile, were bleeding. The Burma Road, the single land supply route from British India into Chongqing, was opened in 1938 and carried the trickle of foreign aid that kept the government alive. When the Japanese closed the road by overrunning Burma in 1942, the airlift over the eastern Himalayas, the hump, took over. American and Chinese pilots flew cargo planes at the limit of their range, over mountains higher than anything flown commercially before or since, losing more aircraft and crews in the process than they lost over Europe. It was a logistical achievement. It was also a trickle, not a flow. For years, the nationalist war economy ran on a fraction of what it needed, while the country behind it ground into poverty. There is a photograph that sits at the center of this part of the film. A line of porters on a road in Sichuan in 1944, carrying sacks of grain on their backs, barefoot, watched by men in foreign uniforms. The road is mud. The sacks are heavy. The men are thin. This is what the nationalist war effort looked like at the base of the system. It is what the American money, when it arrived, would have to climb down through. The Second United Front formally lasted from 1937 to 1941. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June of that year, Moscow lost interest in keeping Chiang and Mao in line. The two sides moved openly back toward a posture of preparing for each other. The communists expanded their base areas. They recruited. They accumulated weapons. They trained their officers in the way that Chiang had trained his, but with a different test for promotion. The 8th Route Army and its companion force, the new 4th Army, were not large. By the end of the war, they were not as large as the nationalist armies on paper. They were, however, intact, rooted, and paid for, in part, by the land reform they carried out in the areas they controlled. The nationalists, by the time the war ended, had fought 8 years of industrial-scale warfare with inadequate equipment, in a country with no functioning tax system, against an enemy who held their richest provinces. The best divisions had been spent in 1937 and 1938. The officer corps had been thinned by combat, by disease, by the slow attrition of a war that had no end in sight. The army that came out of the war in August 1945 was, in numbers, very large. In fighting quality, it was a different army from the one that had fought for Shanghai. This is the nationalist state that the film will follow into the Civil War that began in the autumn of 1945. It is worth pausing here to ask the obvious question. If the situation was this bad, how did the nationalists still hold the country in the summer of 45? The answer is that they held it for two reasons, both of them external. The Japanese were still occupying the coast in the major cities, and so the nationalists, in their mountain capital, were nominally the government of a country they did not physically control. When the Japanese surrendered, the vacuum created by their withdrawal was enormous. Whoever could move fastest into it would inherit it. And that is what happened. The United States airlifted nationalist troops to the coast and to Manchuria. The communists, who had no air force and no transport, were left to walk. By the end of 1945, the nationalists were back in Nanjing, in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Wuhan. The coastal economy was, for the moment, restored to them. The customs houses were working again. The salt tax was flowing again. The appearance of strength was back. The structure underneath was the same one that had come out of Chongqing, but now there was American money on top of it. The communist leadership understood what was happening. In a series of telegrams between Mao Zedong in Yan'an and his commanders in the field, the instruction was to avoid fixed battles, to give ground in the cities, to move into the countryside, to conserve force, to wait. The instruction is not a slogan, it is a calculation. The communists believed, correctly, that time was on their side. The nationalist state could not solve its own internal contradictions by retreating to Chongqing. With peace, with the cities back, with American money starting to flow, the pressure to fix the structure would relax. And when the pressure relaxed, the structure would not fix itself. It would decay. So the war with Japan is not, in this telling, a separate chapter. It is the long preparation for the war that came after. It cost Chiang his best troops, his tax base, his ports, his modern economy, and 8 years of doing nothing about the things that were wrong inside his own army and his own government. It gave the communists time, space, and a foothold in the countryside. It handed the nationalists the appearance of victory in 1945 and the substance of defeat. In the next part of the film, we look at the Americans, because in the 4 years that followed the Japanese surrender, the United States would pour more money, more weapons, more uniforms, more transport, more ammunition, more advisors into nationalist China than it had poured into any country in its history up to that point. And it would not save the country. The question is why? The American relationship with Chiang Kai-shek began in the early 1940s, in the months after Pearl Harbor, and it began as an act of strategic necessity rather than affection. China had been at war with Japan since 1937. After December 1941, Japan was at war with the United States. The two wars were the same war, and Washington needed to think about what Chiang could do and what he could be persuaded to do in the larger fight against Tokyo. The man they sent to find out was a hard-drinking, plain-spoken army officer named Joseph Stilwell, who arrived in Chongqing in early 1942 as the chief of staff to the Generalissimo and the commander of American forces in the China-Burma-India theater. The picture that Stilwell sent back to Washington, in memoranda and in person, was not the picture that Washington wanted. Stilwell watched Chiang refuse to commit his best divisions to the operations the Americans were planning. He watched Chinese commanders refuse to follow orders from a foreigner, even when those orders came from their own government. He watched supplies that had been allocated for combat disappear into depots that were never opened. He watched his own requests for information be answered, when they were answered at all, with polite evasion. He wrote, in his famous terse style, that the Generalissimo was more interested in preserving his own forces for the post-war fight against the communists than in actually fighting the Japanese. The cable traffic from Chongqing to Washington during these years is full of phrases like this. It is also full of phrases from the China hands at the embassy, the small group of State Department officers who read Chinese and had been watching the nationalists for years. The China hands are a recurring figure in this part of the film because they were almost always right and almost always ignored. Men like John Service, John Patton Davies, and John Carter Vincent filed long, careful reports from inside China describing the gap between the nationalist image in Washington and the nationalist reality on the ground. They documented the corruption. They described an army whose units existed on paper but not in the field. They warned that American aid, if it was not tied to reform, would simply fund the rot. They were right. They were also a problem for the Roosevelt administration because they were telling a story that did not fit the war narrative. The story Roosevelt wanted to tell was that the United States had four great allies, the Big Four: Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and itself. China, in this story, was going to be a great power after the war. Roosevelt believed it. He repeated it. He did not always want to hear the field reports that said it was not true. There is a parallel story that runs through this part of the film, and it is the one that the American public saw. In February 1943, Jiang's wife, Soon Mei-ling, known in the West as Madame Jiang, addressed a joint session of the United States Congress. She was only the second woman ever to do so, and the first Chinese citizen. She had been educated in the United States, at Wellesley College, and her English was fluent, idiomatic, and lightly accented. She spoke about the war, about the 4 years China had already been fighting, about what the loss of China would mean for the post-war world. She sat with Eleanor Roosevelt. She received a standing ovation. The press treated her as a celebrity. The image of nationalist China that took root in the American imagination in those weeks was the image of a brave, modern, Christian, pro-Western ally, led by a soldier and his well-educated wife, fighting the good fight against the Japanese. It was a real image. It was also incomplete. Madame Chiang could not address the joint session about the padded payrolls in the nationalist divisions. She could not speak about the salt tax. She could not talk about the army list that included a division somewhere in Gansu that had been paid for 3 years and had not yet been raised. The reality behind the image was the reality the China hands were describing in their reports. In late 1944, the friction between Stilwell and Chiang came to a head. The immediate cause was the military situation in Burma and in eastern China, where Japanese offensives had cut off American airfields and exposed the limits of nationalist cooperation. The deeper cause was that Chiang wanted Stilwell removed because Stilwell kept telling him what to do, and because Stilwell kept being right. Chiang asked Roosevelt to recall him. Roosevelt, who had been warned by his own people that Stilwell was impossible but necessary, and who was dependent on Chiang for the China theater in the last months of the war, complied. Stilwell left. The episode is one of the small hinge points of the film because it told Chiang in the clearest possible way that the Americans would not push him to reform. They would complain. They would grumble. In the end, if it came to a choice between their own general and their Chinese ally, they would choose the ally. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. The surrender was the moment when American aid to nationalist China began in earnest, and it began on a scale that deserves a moment of attention because the numbers are hard to grasp without context. Between the surrender and the end of 1946, the United States transported more than 500,000 nationalist troops by sea and air from the rear areas of China to the coast, and from the coast to Manchuria. It transferred to the nationalist government large stocks of weapons and vehicles that had been built up for the war against Japan. It began a program of lend-lease and surplus property transfers that ran into hundreds of millions of dollars in current values, and into the tens of billions if the long tail of post-war aid is included. Aircraft, ships, trucks, rifles, ammunition, radios, uniforms, medical supplies. By the autumn of 1945, the nationalists were, in material terms, the best armed force in Asia. Then came General George Marshall. Marshall, the architect of the American victory in Europe, was sent to China in December 1945 as a special envoy. His mission was to negotiate a ceasefire between the nationalists and the communists, and to broker a coalition government that would hold China together. He spent the next year in Chongqing, Nanjing, and Yan'an, shuttling between the two sides. The negotiations are well documented. The agreement that finally emerged in January 1946 was a ceasefire and a broad plan for a multi-party government. It held, in parts of the country, for a few months. By the spring, it was breaking down. By the summer, full-scale fighting had resumed in Manchuria and in the Yangtze Valley. Marshall came home at the end of 1946. In January 1947, President Truman recalled Marshall to serve as Secretary of State, and the United States, on Marshall's recommendation, withdrew the mediation mission and imposed an arms embargo on both sides. The embargo is worth pausing on. It was, in theory, neutral. It forbade the sale of weapons from American stockpiles to either the nationalists or the communists. In practice, it was not neutral at all, because the communists had no access to American weapons in the first place. The embargo bit only one side. Chiang, who had been counting on a continuing flow of equipment, lost a pipeline he had been planning around. He was furious. He saw it, with some justification, as a humiliation. The embargo lasted about a year. In the spring and summer of 1948, with the nationalists visibly losing, Congress passed and Truman signed the China Aid Act, which provided roughly $400 million in economic assistance and authorized the resumption of military aid on a limited basis. By then, the embargo was a smaller fact than it had been, because the nationalists were already losing the war, and the weapons were arriving too late for the campaigns of 1948 and 1949. The American relationship with Chiang in this period, then, is a story of escalation and frustration. The aid was enormous. The conditions attached to it, modest by the standards of later decades, were often ignored. The Americans complained about corruption, about the hoarding of equipment, about the failure to carry out the land reform that everyone agreed was necessary, about the failure to integrate the communists into a coalition. The complaints had limited effect. Chiang listened, nodded, and went on as before. The Americans then concluded, as Americans often conclude in such situations, that the only thing wrong with the strategy was the will of the ally, and they increased the aid. This is the recurring pattern that the film will keep returning to, because it is the pattern that explains a great deal of what happened. Aid substituted for reform. Money substituted for political work. The presence of American equipment substituted for the discipline to use it. Each American intervention raised the appearance of nationalist strength without raising its substance. Each intervention also reduced, in the view of the people making the decisions in Nanjing, the urgency of doing the things that would actually have made a difference. There is a second pattern here, and it concerns the advisors. The Americans sent a stream of them: military advisors to train the nationalist army, economic advisors to advise on currency reform and tax collection, political advisors to suggest, gently, that perhaps it would be a good idea to broaden the government. The advisors wrote reports. The reports were, in many cases, very good. They were also, in many cases, ignored. The pattern was the same in every field. The Chinese studied the report, picked out the recommendations that did not threaten anyone's interests, and shelved the rest. The advisor went home. A new advisor arrived. The reports piled up. Nothing changed. There is one more thing to be said about the American period, and it is the thing the China hands had understood all along. The nationalists were not going to be saved by American money because the nationalists were not, in the sense that mattered, fighting for a country that wanted to be saved by them. The communists were recruiting in the villages by offering land. The nationalists were recruiting by press gang and losing. The communists were issuing a currency people accepted in their base areas. The nationalists were printing a currency that lost half its value in a year. The Americans could send in all the rifles in the federal stockpile, and the rifles would still end up in the hands of whoever had the loyalty of the soldier holding them. By the end of 1946, it was becoming clear that the rifles in many places would end up in communist hands. In the next part of the film, we go inside the national estate to look at the rot that the aid could not reach. The padded army lists, the conscription by rope, the officer corps promoted on personal loyalty, the family firms. And then, at the center of it, the currency, which is the single most important thread in the whole story, because when the state cannot pay its own soldiers in money that means anything, the state has already lost, and everything that follows is just the working out of the loss. The American money arrived in trucks and cargo planes. What it arrived into was a state that had been hollowing out for 20 years. Start with the army. By the end of the war with Japan, the nationalists had a paper strength of several million men, organized into more than 200 divisions. The real strength was a fraction of that, and the gap between the two numbers is the first window into how the state actually worked. A division in the Kuomintang order of battle was a unit on a chart in Nanjing. It had a divisional number, a nominal commander, a nominal strength figure. Whether it had the men, the rifles, the food, the medical company, the transport, the radios, was a separate question, and the answer varied from theater to theater. In some units, the payroll listed soldiers who had been dead for years. In others, the payroll listed soldiers who had never existed at all. A colonel would draw the pay of his nominal strength and pass a portion of it up the chain. The portion that reached a soldier in the field was small. The portion that reached anyone at all, if the unit was, in practice, a paper unit, was zero, and stayed zero, because the bookkeeping required the existence of the unit. The arithmetic of this is straightforward once you see it. If you control the books, you can create a division that exists only on paper, draw its pay indefinitely, and pocket the funds. If you control a real division, you can do the same thing by underreporting its strength. Either way, the payroll grows, the system grows, the people at the top of the system grow rich, and the soldier at the bottom does not see any of it. The system works as long as the money keeps coming. When the money stops, the soldier walks away, because there is no reason to stay. The conscription system that fed the army was built on the same principle, turned upside down. In a state with a functioning civil administration, conscription draws from a registered population, with medical exams, with exemptions for the only son, with deferments for students, with quotas set by province and met by negotiation. The nationalist conscription system, by the mid-1940s, was none of these things. It was, in many provinces, a press gang. Local recruitment officers, working under quota, were given a number of men to deliver. They would roam the villages, the markets, the tea houses, the river landings, and seize young men, often tying them together with rope for transport to the nearest depot. The recruits would then be marched, under guard, to a training camp. The desertion rate was enormous. The death rate on the march was not negligible. The recruits who arrived at the camp were often too weak or too sick to train, and were sometimes left to die. This is the thing that the China hands had been writing about for years, and the thing that the aid packages could not fix. A conscription system that is, in practice, a manhunt, produces soldiers who have no stake in the state that has kidnapped them. They will not fight for it. They will surrender at the first opportunity. They will take the first chance to desert. They will not, in the moment of crisis, hold a line. The 8th Route Army did not need to outfight the nationalists man for man. It needed only to be the army that the soldier who had been seized by the rope preferred to belong to. The officer corps was the third leg of this. Chiang had built his army at Whampoa. The cadets who came out of Whampoa were his men. They were promoted on the basis of loyalty to him and to the patrons who had recommended them. A capable officer who lacked the right patron could spend the war as a captain. An incapable officer with the right patron could end up as a divisional commander. This is the way family firms work, and the Kuomintang by the 1940s was a family firm. There were many such families. The most prominent were the Changs, the Sums, the Kungs, and the Chens. They ran the party, the government, the army, the banks, and the major industrial enterprises, often at the same time. The Sum family in particular sat at the intersection of finance, politics, and international diplomacy. TV Soon was the foreign minister and at various points the finance minister. H. Kung was at various points the finance minister and the head of the central bank. The two were brothers-in-law of the Generalissimo. Madame Chang, née Soon, was the third. This is not a story about individual corruption in the ordinary sense. It is a story about structure. The boundary between public money and private interest was not clearly drawn because the people at the top did not want it to be drawn. A foreign loan negotiated by TV Soong could be deposited in a bank controlled by Soong family interests, with terms favorable to the bank. A government contract for military supplies could be awarded to a firm in which the awarding official had an interest. The firm would then deliver, or not deliver, the goods, and the contract would be renewed anyway because the renewal was a matter of patronage. The system was self-reinforcing. Reform would have required the people at the top to give up the structure that kept them at the top. The American advisors saw this. The reports from the embassy and from the military missions are full of specific examples of contracts that were awarded and never delivered, of commissions on foreign exchange that went somewhere other than the treasury, of price differentials between what the government paid and what the goods actually cost. The reports were read in Washington. They were largely set aside because the alternative was to conclude that the ally was not an ally. The currency is the part of the film that has to be told in detail because it is the part that explains why the state stopped working when it stopped working. Before the war, the nationalist currency, the Fabi, had been reformed in the 1930s under the leadership of TV Kum, and it had held its value reasonably well. The war destroyed this. From the moment the government retreated to Chongqing, it began financing its expenditure by printing. There was no other way. The eastern tax base had been lost. Foreign loans were insufficient. The result was a slow, grinding inflation that lasted for the 8 years of the war and that ate into the savings of anyone who held paper money. A teacher who had saved for a year to buy a bicycle in 1938 could not afford a meal by 1944. The numbers were not yet catastrophic, but they were visible, and they were corrosive. People who understood what was happening began to convert their paper into gold, into foreign currency, into land, into goods. After the war, with the coastal provinces recovered, there was a brief moment when stabilization seemed possible. The Fabi had been displaced in the interior by a separate currency, and the reunification of the currency system was supposed to be the first step in putting the economy back together. It did not happen. The government needed money to demobilize, to reabsorb the wartime armies, to move troops to Manchuria, to begin the Civil War. It printed. The inflation, which had been running at high but not absurd rates through the war, began to accelerate. The figures that follow are reported in official histories and in the academic literature on the period, and they are estimates, because no one was producing reliable statistics on a currency that was changing value by the week. The price index in major cities rose by something like 100 times between the end of the war and the end of 1947. By the spring of 1948, it was rising by the day. There is a well-known story from this period of a Chengdu merchant who wired money to Shanghai to pay a debt, and arrived 3 days later to find that the sum he had sent now covered a fraction of what he owed. There are photographs from the summer of 1948 of rickshaw pullers in Nanjing carrying stacks of paper notes so tall that they had to be strapped to the cargo platform of the rickshaw. The notes were worthless within hours of being printed. The effect on the army was direct. A captain's salary in the autumn of 1947, paid in Fabi, would buy a meal. By the spring of 1948, paid in Fabi, it would buy a bowl of rice. By the summer, it would buy nothing the officer could carry. Officers began, where they could, to live off the countryside, which is a polite way of describing the system of requisitioning food and goods from villages that had no ability to refuse. The soldiers did the same. The discipline of the army, already low, fell apart at the bottom. A unit that cannot pay its men, or pay them only in money that will not buy bread, is a unit that will not fight. It is also a unit that will desert, that will surrender, that will change sides at the first opportunity. The communists were offering land to the families of recruits. The nationalists were offering paper. In August 1948, Chiang attempted a currency reform. The new currency, the gold yuan, was to be backed by the country's gold and foreign exchange reserves and was to be exchanged for fabi at a rate of 1 gold yuan to 3 million fabi. The reform was accompanied by strict limits on the holding of foreign currency in gold and by a deadline for the surrender of existing holdings to the state. The reasoning was that a credible gold-backed currency would break the inflationary expectations and restore confidence. The reform failed within weeks. The reserves were insufficient to back the new currency at the value at which it was being exchanged. The deadline for the surrender of gold produced a brief surge of receipts and then a collapse, because once it became clear that the new currency was also going to be printed, anyone who could converted back. The price of gold in Shanghai rose tenfold in the first month of the reform. By the autumn of 1948, the gold yuan was also worthless. The inflation that the reform had been meant to stop resumed, faster than before. There is a moment in this part of the film that has to be set down carefully because it is the moment the state stopped working. It is the moment in the autumn of 1948 when a nationalist division in Manchuria, surrounded and cut off, surrendered to a smaller communist force, and the communist soldiers walked into the nationalist supply dumps and ate the rice and wore the American uniforms and loaded the American rifles into the trucks. The reason the nationalist soldiers surrendered was not that they were outfought. It was that they had not been paid in money worth anything for longer than they could remember. And the officers who told them to keep fighting had not been paid in money worth anything either. And the men on the other side of the line were being given land. That is the mechanism. The rest of the film is the working out of the mechanism. In the next part, we go to the countryside where the communists were doing the thing that the nationalists would not do, and then to the 3 campaigns of 1948 and 1949, where the war was, in the most literal sense, decided. To understand why the Civil War ended where and when it did, you have to leave the cities and go to the countryside, because the countryside is where the war was actually being fought. The Chinese countryside in the 1940s was not a place of small owner farmers working their own fields. It was, in the areas south of the Great Wall and east of the Tibetan Plateau, overwhelmingly a place of tenants. The figures vary by province, but the pattern is consistent across the academic literature and across the memoirs of the period. In much of the Yangtze Valley and the southeast, perhaps half or more of the cultivated land was held by tenants who paid rent to an owner they did not see, and who paid it, in many arrangements, not in a fixed sum, but in a share of the harvest, often half or more. In poorer regions, the share could be higher. The landlord class, who lived in the towns and the county seats, and often in the cities, took the surplus and re-loaned part of it to the same tenants at interest. A family that paid half its harvest in rent and a substantial further sum in interest on the loans it had taken to get through the previous year was not a family with any stake in the existing order. This is the soil in which the communists planted their political work, and the planting is what the nationalists could not match with all the American aid in the world. In the base areas they controlled, the communists did something simple and, for the tenant, almost incomprehensible. They reduced the rent. They canceled the interest. They redistributed land from the landlords to the tenants. The exact mechanism varied from place to place and changed over the years. The policy was not a single document, but a long argument inside the party, but the effect on the village was consistent. A peasant who received title to a portion of the land he had been renting became, overnight, a person with a stake in the state that had given it to him. The 8th Route Army and its companion force, the new 4th Army, behaved in the villages with a discipline that was partly ideological and partly pragmatic. They did not loot. They did not requisition without payment. They were, in many accounts, the first soldiers in the village in living memory who had behaved that way. This is the recruitment argument that no amount of American equipment could answer. A young man in a village in Shandong or Henan in 1946 had a choice, or at least an environment that shaped his choice. He could be seized by a nationalist press gang and marched away in rope. He could be recruited by the local communist cadre and sent off to fight for the 8th Route Army, with the knowledge that the land his family had been renting had been given to them. The arithmetic is not subtle. The communists did not need to outfight the nationalists. They needed only to be the army that the village preferred its sons to join. The military situation in 1946 and 1947 was, on the surface, different. The communists were on the strategic defensive in the north, and they were taking losses. They were being pushed back from the railways and the cities they had occupied in the immediate aftermath of the Japanese surrender. Lin Biao, who would become the architect of the communist victory in the northeast, was sent to Manchuria in the spring of 1946 with a force that, by the standards of the nationalists, was small. He retreated into the countryside, into the mountains along the Chinese-Korean border. There, he did what Mao had told him to do. He avoided fixed battles. He built up his force from. By the spring of 1949, the war was over in everything but name. The three great campaigns of the previous year had destroyed the fighting power of the nationalists in the north and the center. The Yangtze, the last natural barrier, was still in nationalist hands. Behind it lay the cities that had been the heart of the regime for 20 years, Nanjing, the capital, and Shanghai, the port that paid for it. The Yangtze is wide. At Nanjing it is more than a mile across, and in the spring of 1949, the current was running fast with the snowmelt from the Tibetan plateau. The Nationalist Command had disposed its remaining armies along the river in a long line from Shanghai in the east to Wuhan in the west. The troops were tired, underfed, and in many cases no longer paid in anything that could be called money. The communist armies, under Liu Bocheng and Deng Xiaoping in the center, and under Chen Yi and Su Yu further east, had reached the river in April and spent a month preparing. The crossing began in places on the night of the 20th of April, and in earnest in the days that followed. The communist forces used junks and riverboats collected from the villages along the northern bank, and, in places, the boats of fishermen who had been waiting for the order. The nationalist gunners fired, but the artillery was thin and the ammunition unreliable. Units on the southern bank, faced with the prospect of being surrounded, began to surrender. Within a week the line had been pierced in several places. Within 2 weeks it had ceased to exist as a line. The fall of Nanjing on the 23rd of April was almost an afterthought. The communist soldiers entered the city in the early hours of the morning, before many of the residents were awake. There was no fighting in the streets. The nationalist garrison had withdrawn across the river to the south, or had melted into the civilian population, or had simply gone home. The flag of the Republic was taken down from the presidential palace. A small group of communist cadres raised the red flag on the roof of the same building a few hours later. The same flag had flown there in secret by underground party members in the years before 1949, and the symbolism was not lost on anyone. Madame Chiang, who had been in the city only weeks before, was already gone. So were the ministries, the central bank, and the gold. Shanghai held out a little longer. The city had no natural defenses except the river and the buildings themselves, and the nationalist commander, the veteran general Tang En-bo, had orders to defend it street by street. The defense did not happen in the form the orders implied. By the time the first communist troops reached the suburbs in mid-May, the city was emptying. The banks had been emptied. The customs houses had been emptied. The factories that could be moved had been moved. The civil administration had, in many places, simply stopped functioning. The communists entered Shanghai on the 27th of May. They did so carefully, in part because Mao had given instructions that the city should be taken intact, and in part because the city's working-class districts had been, since the 1920s, the heart of the communist movement in the South. The takeover was orderly. It was also, for the residents, an experience of being governed by people who had not been in the city for 22 years, and who had come back with notebooks and lists. The proclamation at the Gate of Heavenly Peace on the 1st of October was the formal end of the Civil War. It was not the end of the fighting. There would be mopping up operations in the Southwest for another year, and the war with the United States and Korea would begin within 12 months. But it was the end of the political argument. The People's Republic of China existed. The Republic of China, which had governed the mainland since 1928, existed only on the island of Taiwan, and on a few small islands off the coast of Fujian that the communists had not yet taken. The withdrawal to Taiwan was, in itself, a small historical event that explains a great deal about the two states that came out of the Civil War. Chiang Kai-shek had been thinking about Taiwan as a last redoubt since at least the autumn of 1948. The island had been returned to China by Japan in 1945. It had been a Japanese colony for 50 years before that, and the infrastructure the Japanese had built, railways, ports, power stations, a working civil service, was more developed in many respects than anything on the mainland. Chiang had appointed a trusted governor, Chen Cheng, to administer the island in the closing months of the war. As the mainland fell, the nationalists shipped to Taiwan what they could of the central bank reserves, of the gold that had been moved from Shanghai, and of the contents of the National Palace Museum and the National Central Library in Nanjing. The museum collections are the small, vivid detail at the center of this part of the film. The National Palace Museum held the bulk of the imperial art collection that had been assembled by the Republican government in the early 1930s from the imperial holdings in the Forbidden City. The decision to move the collection had been taken in the early 1930s in anticipation of a Japanese invasion. By the late 1940s, in anticipation of a communist one, the decision was being carried out again, this time across the Taiwan Strait. The crates that arrived in Taipei in the late autumn and winter of 1948 and the spring of 1949 contained some of the most important objects of Chinese civilization. The jade cabbages, the Song dynasty landscape scrolls, the bronze vessels from the Shang and Zhou dynasties, the paintings that had hung in the imperial palaces for centuries. The crates were unloaded under military guard. The objects inside them are still in Taipei, in a museum built to house them, and they are still, after 3/4 of a century, the property of the Republic of China on Taiwan. The gold was more important, in the short run, for what it allowed the nationalist state on Taiwan to do. The reserves that arrived on the island in the closing months of the Civil War gave the new government the financial basis for the currency stabilization of 1949 and the land reform of the early 1950s. The land reform in particular is worth setting down, because it is the thing that the nationalists did on Taiwan that they had refused to do on the mainland, and it is the thing that allowed the regime to survive. The reform was carried out in stages through the early 1950s, and it did something that the communists were doing at the same time across the strait. It gave the land to the tenants. It broke the power of the local landlord class, much of which was Taiwanese rather than mainlander. It created a constituency of small owner farmers who had a stake in the survival of the state. By the late 1950s, the Republic of China, on Taiwan, was an authoritarian, single-party state. But it was a state that had paid for the loyalty of its rural population with the only currency that mattered in a Chinese village. In August 1949, 2 months before the proclamation at Tiananmen, the United States State Department published a document that became known as the White Paper, and that became known in American politics as the document that ended the argument in Washington about who had lost China. The White Paper was a long, detailed account of the American relationship with nationalist China from the 1930s to the summer of 1949. It concluded, in essence, that the outcome had been beyond American power to change. The reasons it gave were the reasons this film has been laying out, chapter by chapter: the corruption, the military failures, the loss of popular support, the economic collapse. The implication, which Secretary of State Dean Acheson made plain in his covering letter, was that no different policy, no different level of aid, no different advisor, no different general would have produced a different result. The White Paper was received in Washington as an attempt to settle a political argument, and in doing so, it began another. Critics on the right said the document was a confession of betrayal, that the administration had withheld aid that could have saved Chiang, that the communists had triumphed because the State Department had been staffed by sympathizers. Critics on the left said the document was a defense of the policy of trying to save a corrupt and doomed regime with American money. Both readings were partial. The document itself was closer to the truth that the film has been arguing. The nationalist state was hollow before the aid began. The aid did not fill it. In some places, the aid made it worse by removing the pressure to fill it. The outcome was decided in the Chinese countryside, in the Chinese currency, in the Chinese officer corps, in the Chinese villages where the party that arrived with a land reform beat the party that arrived with a rope. Chiang Kai-shek lived for another 25 years on Taiwan, governing through the martial law period, losing the seat in the United Nations in 1971 and dying in Taipei in 1975 at the age of 87. He did not, to the end, accept that the Civil War was over. The Republic of China, in his telling, remained the government of all of China. The People's Republic in Beijing was, in his telling, a rebel regime. He did not live to see the political and economic transformations that would, in the decades after his death, make both of these positions increasingly difficult to maintain. The film closes on the arithmetic with which it began. In 1945, Chiang Kai-shek had the recognized government, the bigger army, the air force, the ports, the cities, and the wealthiest patron on earth writing the checks. In 1949, he had an island, a set of crates, a gold reserve, and a museum. The reason is not a mystery, it is a mechanism, and the mechanism is the one the film has been tracing from the first frame. A government that cannot pay a soldier in money worth anything is a government that has already lost. A government that cannot tax a village is a government that cannot reach that village. A government that promotes its officers on personal loyalty rather than on competence is a government that will be outgeneraled at the moment that matters. No amount of foreign money, delivered in crates and in cargo planes, can substitute for those things, because the things that make a state work are the things the state itself must do. The aid was never the missing piece, the state was, and the state, by the summer of 1949, was no longer there to be saved.